All right, let's talk about a huge question in education. When schools are really struggling to find and keep good teachers, can you just throw money at the problem and make it go away? We're going to dig into that today by looking at a fascinating real-world experiment that went down in South Carolina. Let's get into it.
So this is really the core issue, right? States, districts, they're pouring millions of dollars into financial incentives to try and staff their most challenging schools. But the big question that looms over all of it is all that money actually making a difference? Is it working? That's what we're here to figure out. And to get a sense of just how big this problem is, just look at this number, 6,000. In a single school year, 2020 to 2021, more than 6,000 teachers in South Carolina just didn't come back. That's not just some abstract statistic. That's a full-blown crisis that affects kids in classrooms every single day.
Okay, so let's start by breaking down what this crisis actually looks like. Because, as you're about to see, the problem is way more complicated than you might think from a simple headline.
You know, what's so interesting here is that we often talk about a national teacher shortage, but the research shows that's not really the right way to think about it. It's actually a collection of thousands of tiny local crises. Get this, most teachers end up working within just 15 miles of where they grew up. So you can literally have one district that's flooded with great applicants right next door to another one that is absolutely desperate for staff. It's a matching problem, not just a numbers game.
And this leads to a pretty harsh reality, something researchers have given a very vivid, if not a little brutal name, the dance of the lemons. It describes this process where the wealthier, more advantaged districts can basically cherry-pick the best, most experienced teachers. They poach them, leaving the high poverty and rural districts to pick from a much smaller, often less qualified pool of candidates.
So facing this exact problem, South Carolina decided to launch this really ambitious experiment to see if they could break that cycle. They called it the Rural Recruitment Initiative, or the RRI. And the idea was actually pretty simple, but also really powerful. Give state money directly to the districts that needed it most, the ones with sky-high teacher turnover, and then let them decide how to spend it. That word flexible is the key. No more one-size-fits-all rules from the state. This was about local control. Now, the history of the program is super revealing. It started out pretty small, then got a huge funding bump. But look closely at what happens next. The funding basically flatlines and even drops a little, but the number of districts it has to serve just keeps going up. Hold on to that thought, because it's going to be really important later. And when they said flexible, they really meant it. Districts could use the cash for just about anything they thought would help. They could offer salary stipends, help teachers buy a house, pay for extra training, even cover fees to bring in international teachers. The whole point was to let each community solve its own unique problems. Okay, so you've got this flexible program, you've got millions of dollars flowing in. Which brings us to the big million-dollar question, what was the actual impact? Did it work?
Researchers really dug in. They looked at a decade's worth of data, comparing the districts that got the money to similar ones that didn't, trying to isolate the true effect of the program. So, what did they find?
The answer is yes, it worked. But, and this is a huge but, the effect was small. The study found that the RRI funding led to a drop in teacher turnover of just over 0.5 percentage point. So yeah, it's a statistically significant effect. It's real, but it's maybe not the giant, game-changing result everyone was hoping for.
Let's put that number into human terms. What does a 0.5% reduction actually look like? Well, for an average district in the program, it meant that about 3 or 4 teachers who probably would have left decided to stick around for another year. Now, don't get me wrong, every one of those teachers matters immensely, but it definitely helps put the scale of the impact into perspective.
But it gets even more interesting when you dig a little deeper. The impact wasn't the same for everyone. For what they call fringe rural districts, think rural areas that are closer to towns or cities, the effect was nearly double. We're talking a full 1% drop in turnover. This tells us that where a district is located really matters when it comes to how well these kinds of incentives work. So this is the puzzle, right? We've got a policy that clearly had some positive effect, but just a small one. Which leads to the next big question, why? Why wasn't the impact bigger? And the answer, it turns out, is all about the gap between a great idea and how it actually gets put into practice. And this slide really gets to the heart of it. The promise of the RRI was amazing. Empower local districts with flexible money. But the reality was that the money got spread way too thin as more and more districts became eligible. And maybe even more important, the funding wasn't guaranteed. It could disappear from one year to the next.
This chart shows you exactly what that looked like. Even when the total amount of money went up, the number of districts it had to cover went up even faster. So the amount of money per district, it actually went down. It was diluted, which meant nobody had enough cash to make a really big, game-changing move.
And that right there is the key. If you're a district leader and you're not sure if you're going to get this funding again next year, are you going to start some big, ambitious long-term program like a grow your own teacher pipeline? No way. You can't risk it. So instead, you're forced to use the money on short-term fixes, which are nice, but they don't solve the root of the problem. So what can we all learn from South Carolina's big experiment? Well, it actually offers some incredibly valuable lessons for anyone, anywhere, who's trying to tackle these kinds of complicated public policy problems.
The researchers boiled it all down to 3 really clear recommendations. First, the money has to be dependable and consistent. You have to be able to plan for the long haul. Second, it has to be adequate. There needs to be enough of it to actually make a real difference. And finally, while flexibility is great, states should also give districts some guidance on what strategies are proven to work.
And that brings us to our final thought here. The RRI showed that an idea like this can work. It proved that flexible funding can move the needle. But it also served as a huge warning that a great idea without enough funding and without reliable funding can only ever do so much. And in a time when teacher shortages are getting worse, not better, it leaves us with a pretty tough question. Can we really afford to design policies that have all the promise in the world but lack the resources to actually deliver on it?